And so what I want to try to turn to this morning is more of a history of gender in particular. So we've located gender within that broad flow of focusing on the modern self, as Truman calls it. But now, like, what has happened in the development of what we refer to today as gender? So I thought a good way to start this would just be to ask you the question, because I know you've used this word, and you hear this word all the time. What would you say is gender? Okay, I've got candy. I'm going to throw candy out for people who answer. Actually, maybe John will. You got me? All right, let's get some ideas out. Okay, John. You just got the candy right before him?
It's how you identify, like, biologically. And I feel like gender gives more of also a mental, identifying of yourself.
Okay.
Whereas the term sex is more of your biological self. Like, I feel like gender is more of something that you kind of create in your mind, especially how it's used today.
Okay, all right. Yeah. John's making that distinction between what he called gender and sex. Sex being more of the biological thing and gender being more of the mental or the psychological state. All right, what else?
Years ago, you asked that question here, and anybody who's my age and older would just be like, male and female, what are you asking?
There you go.
And so, like, now, everybody's not answering because the way it is, you can't decide, are they supposed to say something, or maybe it does mean something different. And they're changing the definition of what it is. Because the applications for your driver's license may say gender, and it was two options. So that's,
Didn't take that long to change. So gender, basically a synonym for sex, a synonym for just male or female, right? Purely biological question. Yeah?
I think there's a cultural component to it.
Okay.
Because cultures differ in terms of what they think is a typical or appropriate expression.
Oh, okay. Expression of what?
Of the sexuality
Okay.
of that person in terms of, but it's not limited to sexuality, but in terms of roles, responsibilities, I think there's a lot that goes into it.
Okay. So different cultures are going to express this in different ways. Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you think of one example of that? Can anybody think of an example of that? How two different cultures might express these ideas in two very different ways. Yeah, Ashley?
Clothing.
Okay, clothing.
I think religion, like, if I could give two examples of how two different religions would identify gender, with Christianity, there's only two genders.
Right.
But with within the LGBTQ community, it's just like you could be like whatever you want, and I'm not buying that.
So there's a lot more options depending on, and that's true for the LGBTQ. We can also look at it in terms of some Eastern worldviews that have a wide range of options on these things, and it's not driven by the same kinds of rationale that your Western LGBTQ advocate would give for multiple genders, but it's rooted in a very different type of worldview that there's a God for everything, and there's different expressions, and there's no one thing. So yeah, in different worldviews we see that differently. Good. So what about clothing? What would be an example of clothing? Yeah.
Well, in our society, women wear dresses, men wear jeans. But if you're Scottish, you see a guy in a kilt, you kind of scratch your head, wonder what that's all about.
Sure. Yeah, especially if he's slaying men on the battlefield with a giant sword and yelling freedom. Seems masculine, notwithstanding the apparel. Good. Yeah, very good. Any other ways you might define this? Any other ways you might have heard it? Can I pick on Lydia for a second? Has this come up for you at all as you've been taking college classes? Have you noticed this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the big thing that they
Okay, good. And you get asked those questions, don't you? Yeah. 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 Huh?
I once watched a video where a guy went to a tribe in Africa and he asked them, what is a woman, what is a man? And they mocked him, they laughed at him, they thought he was stupid. Like, how do you not know? I think that it's very clear what gender is, man and woman, but Satan or the LGBTQ group has confused that either on purpose or not on purpose, I don't know, but they've transformed something that's so clear and so basic and just causes mass confusion. And I have had students tell me that, there's 100 genders, and I can be whatever I want, and you are wrong to tell me that I have to dance this role or that role in a show because I can do whatever I want to be.
Right.
And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. That was just a point Holly and I were talking about recently. This isn't something that's out there somewhere. This isn't something that's coming. This is something that's here. This is something that we currently deal with. And maybe you haven't had enough conversations to see this, but you maybe you just need to have more conversations with people, right? It's here, and it's something we have to deal with. We have to think through as Christians, okay? We have to think through this for ourselves, for our own sanctification intellectually. But boy, we've got kids and grandkids who are dealing with these and will continue to deal with these questions, and so we need to think through them. And so even as we locate, and one of the ways that we do that is to understand how we got to the point where we're at. So we can locate this within the broader scope of what we refer to as the rise and triumph of the modern concept of the self and this expressive individualism where I can be anything I express myself to be, and that's real. Or maybe it's not real. Maybe nothing's real. But I think it's also helpful to see this in the very specific origins and development, evolution of the concept of gender, because it doesn't go back nearly as far as the last study. This one only goes back to the previous century. And so what we've just identified here are a number of different ways that we have heard gender defined. And I'm just going to give you, if you don't have to write all these down, but just a few different ones, okay? So we covered the biological term. So gender is a biological term, just basically male and female. Your makeup as chromosomes and reproductive anatomy, okay? As Caleb was saying, male, female. But, you can look at it in terms of a sociological term, but the roles and the expectations that a society creates and associates with maleness and femaleness. This is what is often referred to as a social construct. Anybody ever heard that expression? Social construct. What is a social construct? Because I'll use this a number of times here, and you'll hear it a number of times. It's a concept or idea that is created by a society rather than transcending a society. It's created and really maintained by a society rather than transcending a society or existing independently of a society. And by transcending a society, I would mean that it would be true not just for this time and this place, but for all times and all places. Now, that's what we mean by social construct. Society constructs it. Right? You can also talk about it in terms of psychological term, a person's inner sense. And notice I'm using maleness and femaleness, and I there wasn't enough room to put all the other options that were on there. So. Well, that's a little bit facetious, but we'll come back to why I'm doing just two. I'm assuming this, of course. But what we refer to as gender identity, right? There's philosophical ways of understanding this, the state of a person's soul. So maybe something you haven't considered is gender limited to your body, or is your soul also gendered? Something to think about. And plenty of other ways it's used, right? If you pull up the internet and you do searches for what is gender, you could probably add a few more screens on this, okay? But these are some of the main ways people talk about it. And just notice how many of these are mutually exclusive, aren't they? Right? So the psychological or the philosophical understanding of the state of a person's soul would be irrespective of the particular state of the person's body or what particular society they might happen to be inhabiting at that particular time. So it wouldn't be constructed by society. Society doesn't construct your soul. So no, we have to recognize that we can't just say they're all equally good definitions. They can't be all equally good definitions because they contradict one another in different ways. And so I'm not going to jump right into trying to give you a biblical definition for it. Rather, what I want to do is go through the history of where the term came from, how it has evolved to the point where it's at, and really what I'm referring to as the rise and fall of gender. Because what we're going to see as we go through this is that it wasn't a term that was used in the way that we use it today. It became a term that we use today, and in some circles, it's being argued that we need to get rid of this term, the rise and the fall of gender. So let's go to the rise then, okay? When did this all start? Well, prior to the 1950s, people had sexes, words had genders, okay? People had sexes, words had genders. Sex was a biological category, and it was a binary biological category. It was male or female, which would be rooted in a person's, so you can say, the reproductive anatomy. Okay? It's prior to the 50s. But things began to change around the late 40s, 50s, certainly 60s, and past that. There's a great book by a former feminist called Abigail, and I think it's Favali. If I'm butchering her last name, I apologize to her. The book's called Genesis of Gender. It's got a very good history of this. I would caution you a little bit on it because she is a Roman Catholic, and when she begins arguing positively, I think she misses the mark on some things. So I recommend that with caution. But in terms of getting the flow of thought on gender, it's a pretty good resource. So a lot of this you can find in more detail through that resource. But things began to change in the late 40s and early 50s. Okay, two people in particular. The French philosopher and playwright Jean-Paul Sartre and his longtime companion, open relationship with her, Simone de Beauvoir. You can see their dates there, and they're really publishing in the mid to late 40s, and so it's the 50s when those things begin to really take root in society, and you really begin to see them bearing fruit, if you want to call it that. So Jean-Paul Sartre, he's building on the work of predecessors, some of whom we've mentioned in the previous studies, guys like Nietzsche, but German philosophers like Heidegger and others. Sartre, he's really, he doesn't create existentialism. The idea is growing by the time he's writing, but he sure popularizes it in some of he writes a novel, and then he writes his very important work that popularizes this, a book called Being and Nothingness in 1943. So he is popularizing existentialism. Now, let me define that in the simplest way that I can. Existentialism is the philosophical view that life has no inherent, God-given, predetermined purpose. Life has no inherent, God-given, predetermined purpose. Who we are, in terms of our purpose, is not determined. We are free to determine that for ourselves. That's really the emphasis of existentialism. As Sartre put it, freedom is existence, and in it, existence precedes essence. And that's the key phrase. If you look at any philosophy textbook, or if you go on and what is existentialism, you're going to see that phrase in his book, Being and Nothingness. existence precedes essence. So let's unpack that a little bit. What does he mean by that? Well, freedom is existence, by which he means that we're free to determine our own purpose, right? The essence of being is to be able to be self-determining. When he says that existence precedes essence, he's talking about the ability as free entities to determine our own purpose on our own terms. As he says a few years later, man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. You've probably heard a word that recurred in that, himself. Self-focus, self-determination. Okay, that's the essence of what it means to exist and to be free. Okay? Which should make you ask the question, well, what in the world does that have to do with gender? I thought we were talking about gender here. So what does this have to do with gender? Okay. Well, Sartre had this long-time open relationship with a fellow existentialist French philosopher and feminist activist in Simone de Beauvoir. And if Jean-Paul Sartre popularizes existentialism, what de Beauvoir does is she existentializes feminism. And we're using $10 words here, but I'm going to try to explain them. Okay? She existentializes feminism. She basically takes what was going on in the development in feminism. We've already gone through what was called the first wave of feminism, which was in the early 1900s, focused largely on what was called women's suffrage, which was giving women more rights in society, largely having to do with being able to vote, but also issues with property, education, employment, and other things. But so that's kind of largely died down. I think it was the 19th Amendment. Somebody could check me on that. That gives them the right to vote. So they get those things, but there's still some of that in the air, and she's going to be a big proponent of the next wave that's coming up soon. But so she is a feminist in this sense, and she's existentializing feminism. She's taking existence precedes essence, okay, that we determine our own nature and purpose, and then she takes that idea and she applies it to manhood and womanhood. All right, so if this is true, we can be self-determining in this world. Wouldn't that also be true with respect to me as a woman? Do you see how we're bringing these two things together? Here's how she put it in her 1949 book, The Second Sex. Okay, this is the huge seed out of which all of this idea of gender has grown. And it's the sentence: one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Now, how is that an expression of this idea of existentialism? How did she just existentialize feminism with that statement? What does this even mean? One is not born but becomes a woman. Yeah?
She says it was up to her. She determined it because there was no preset purpose. She had to make it.
Exactly. And what is she determining here? Determining what? Her womanhood. She's determining that. She is self-determining this. It's not predetermined for anybody. Womanhood, or manhood for that matter, is not predetermined for anyone. Existence precedes essence, and in this case, it precedes our sex. She does not use the word gender here. We haven't gotten to that yet. The term gender is not being used. The title of the book was The Second Sex. Okay, the second sex is referring to female. Okay, first sex would be male. It's not, the title of the book isn't The Second Gender. She's still using the standard terms of her day. It wasn't gender at this point, it was sex. However, she is using the concept. This is so important. She's using the concept of gender as we're about to see it used more widely in culture. She argues that womanhood is not essential to females. Womanhood then would be what we sometimes would refer to as gender. Female would be biological sex. Okay? Womanhood is not essential, it's not the essence of being a female. Rather, females are socialized into becoming women. So she's making the distinction between female and woman, what we would later see as sex and gender. Womanhood is not essential to a person. It's socially determined. It's socially imposed upon females. And the term we use today is it's socially constructed. She's not using the terms, but do you see where the concepts are being born in this very important work that becomes really the launch pad for everything we're going to see in what's called second wave feminism and in the whole explosion of what we now refer to as gender theory or gender ideology.
Hey, Brett, question.
Yes.
Is womanhood referring to like the roles of a traditional woman?
It would. How femaleness should be expressed.
Okay, so like being a homemaker, taking care of the kids, nurturing, all those things.
Right.
Instead saying, no, if I want to have a career and be a CEO and all that stuff and don't want to have kids, that's fine too.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And where do those expectations come from? About whether the female should be the homemaker or the CEO of the big corporation. Where do those expectations come from? Who constructs them? Are they essential?
Social construct.
Social construct. You following? All right. So she's writing this groundbreaking work challenging the fact that society can place those expectations on women. And by implications, anyone. It's not just womanhood, although that's her emphasis here. And it's rooted in certain ideas. Now you understand why we spent time at the beginning of this going over worldviews. So what does this have to say about our view of God? Unpack for me a little bit. Let's just think through it. We don't have to necessarily evaluate, just understand it. What would this assume about God?
It's something that we determine.
Okay.
As opposed to something that determines us.
Okay, which would be God.
So he's not in the mix at all there.
No, he's not. He's not in the mix. What's the title of the series? Different by design. There's no designer. Designer would flip this around. Designer would say, essence precedes existence. God has a design for you and creates you to live in that design. No, we're flipping that around, which means we have to gut this worldview of any concept of a designer, creator, sustainer, and one who is intimately involved in giving purpose to the universe. What does this say about human beings, our anthropology? Remember the takes questions for a worldview? Theology, anthropology, knowledge, ethics, salvation, kind of what's the big problem and what's the big solution? What does it say about our anthropology, our view of human beings?
That we're the top of the food chain.
That we're the top of the food chain. Buck stops with us. Yeah. Does it say anything else about anthropology? Would this have any implications for our understanding of the basic human nature of being either good or bad?
Well, it's all self-determined. If it's,
Right?
if God's not in the mix, then everything, I'm free to make my life whatever I am my own designer now.
Right. We're free to do it, and we're capable of doing it. Think about what this implies for ethics. There's no outside designer applying a design to us. So where does ethics fit into all of this? Do you see what we're doing? We're trying to understand where the worldview is out of which these ideas are springing and growing. Okay? So it's not until we get to the 50s that the actual term gender begins to show up. I'm going to just introduce this and then we'll finish it next week. It shows up in a guy called John Money. Okay? So this is how we're moving from sex to gender, from the idea of sex prior to the 50s that everybody had to now this concept of gender. And really that term, it wasn't, gender as a non-grammatical term wasn't coined by Money. Others were using it, but there are certain ways that he popularizes it, and there are other expressions that he coins. Okay, so he coined the term gender role. So who's heard that before, gender role? Right, most of us have. It came from John Money. Sexual orientation, that's a popular word that we hear today. That came from John Money. These are terms that he coined. So he's popularizing and in many ways coining certain vocabulary that are commonplace today. All right? So this is where the non-grammatical use of gender is beginning to hit the mainstream. So he was a psychologist and sexologist, and he began his work in the early 50s. So he went to Harvard, and he earned his PhD there in 1952. And then he went on to spend the rest of his life working at Johns Hopkins University. He actually started what was at the time in the 60s called Johns Hopkins, say that 5 times fast, Gender Identity Clinic. And what he's doing in this PhD and what his entire focus is, well, you can see this here in the quote from his dissertation. Gender is the psychological and sociological expression of sex. That's really important. Here's what he did. He just made the distinction between sex and gender. Gender, he's defining it now, is the psychological and socio-cultural expression of sex. I think I said that wrong the first time. Let me do it again, I don't want to mess it up. Gender is the psychological and socio-cultural expression of sex. And by sex, he means our reproductive anatomy. Okay? And what made his work so groundbreaking is he was focusing especially on people whose reproductive anatomy was ambiguous. The term back then was hermaphrodite. The term today is intersex. And so he is using people who have these conditions, for whom it's difficult to determine on a cursory examination what their sex would be. People would have ambiguous genitalia because of certain abnormalities in their chromosomal makeup, right? So we typically see a female has an XX chromosomal structure and males have an XY. But sometimes there are abnormalities. Sometimes things happen where you get an XXY. And in other cases, there might be an XX in some cells or an XY in other cells. So people are born with reproductive organs that are partially developed, and they might have both sets. And so it becomes difficult to categorize them based on their sexual anatomy. And so he's studying these people, and he's asking the question, well, how do they socialize? Do they end up, when you can't tell, and maybe they even can't tell, do they end up becoming more feminine or masculine? What is their psychological state? What is their self-perception? What becomes their sexual orientation? Socioculturally, what are the expectations placed upon them, and how does that work out for them? And he's developing ideas of ways that he thinks he can help with that. And it's rooted in some of the ideas of existentialism, but basically he's taking the ideas, the philosophical ideas of existentialism, and he's going to bring them into the hard sciences. He's going to bring them into medicine and in the study of psychology. And he's going to develop an entire system that has now become the basis for transgender surgery, transgender treatment today. Like when we talk about transgenderism today and the way that we treat it today, this is the guy. All right, he was active for a long time. I mean, you see his dates there. He was going into the 90s, early 2000s. Okay, so that's where we'll stop today. So we'll come back next time and we'll pick up on how he's doing this, how he's taking the ideas, the philosophical ideas of existentialism, and he's bringing them into medicine. And he's gonna mainstream this approach, and he's going to use a very specific case to do that. that we will talk about in detail at some point, because it's extremely relevant for you to know the history of this guy in particular.